right? Do you see it? Okay. So, as the beginning was saying, I'm trying to talk very briefly. I will go over this tool that has been established like in Italy for as a way to solve one of the big problems of like this huge infrastructure that is often cause of delays and raising costs, which is like permitting from third parties. So like large projects often needs like permitting from local jurisdictions, firefighters department, utilities, and many other involved parties like state agencies, federal agencies, depending on the governance of a project. So that's a problem in many countries. Like there are many multiple jurisdictions that have to ensure some sort of like public utility or some public good, like environmental protection, the army, the protection of monuments and historical landscape and things like this. So how do you coordinate this? So this let's say that the typical process is a sort of shuttle process. Let's say when the owner of the project goes to each of these authorities, say, this is our project, we follow it, all the laws and regulation. What do you think? You have to weigh in and then get your approval. And then there is always a margin of interpretation. And that's like tends to delays a lot the project, and there is a lot of back and forth, back and forth. So this was a project that was really like a problem that was really felt in the late 80s in Italy. A lot of projects were like delayed and was a period of crisis, economic crisis and political crisis. So there was a big reform of the administrative law in 1990 to create this conference. The Italian, the direct translation is conference of services. That doesn't make much sense in English, but it's a conference of party of a joint approval process or whatever you want to call it. But it has a few key elements. So it's a sort of one-stop shop for the permitting of any kind of public and private project. So it's not just for transit projects, it's for every kind of project that requires approval from multiple departments. The procedure for public and private is a bit different. So we'll focus on the public one, but transit will fall under this framework. So the idea is really it's a simultaneous, time certain, and conference based process, which is very different from, as I said, something that is more siloed, going authority by authority to get your own permit, sometimes having like contradictory requirements from different authorities or different third parties. It's a system that is based on having sticks and carrots. So you can have like time certainty is one of the stakes. Publicity is one of the stakes. I will go into it a bit more later. But the idea is to foster an approach where everybody is around the same table. That's why it's called a conference. Everybody has to share the concern and the requirements and the comments that they have to have around like the project, and they have to share with all the other third parties. And it's a majority-based decision, so there is no veto power from a single one. It's a sort of form of mediated self-permitting because technically at the end is the agency that self-permits itself based on the recommendation coming out from this process. So it's the core tool of permitting. It's been like a bit different because there's been a devolution of powers to regions in Italy, like over the last 20 years. So there are like regional variations, but it's sometimes in many regions it also includes what is called the simplified environmental review process. So it goes through this. So it's like, or it's parallels, like it's two parallel process. It involves all the relevant like third parties that can like, and there can be many, like with all the utility company like telecoms, electricity, sewage, water, whatever it exists, heritage, environmental, the army sometimes, or other stuff. Like water basin authorities or stuff like this. It can be like up to 60 or 80 participating authorities for complex projects. That's pretty much a statistic I did over like 10 recent projects. That's pretty much the lowest was 58. The highest was like 80 something. There are like several times of this like process, but the most like common one is the permitting one. So it constitutes an official approval and it changes all the planning relevant documents. So it's really a condensation of all the permitting through one process, and like it triggers a number of stuff like eminent domain powers and stuff like this. So sorry, I went back. So the process, just to make you very easy, is like it's initiated by the project owner. There's this figure which is like the legal, you can call it the sponsor or the project manager. It's called in different ways, but it's like an official that say it's like in charge of the project that says, okay, I'm starting this process. I'm sending the project to all the relevant parties, like calling the conference, starting officially the conference. They have like up to 45 days to review through it, and then they start a process that lasts maximum 90 days, but in reality, sometimes it lasts more. So that's part of the carrot thing. Like they can give more time for revision, and they can like sort of meet several times in this sort of conferences, and then they can send like written comments. There can be like a sort of like reduced conference between a number of people that are like a number of like parties that are around a specific problem. So there is like a sort of like flexibility in how they can manage this that really is in charge of the RUP, this like sort of sponsored project. And so until they reach a final one where there's a sort of consensus with a list of
Yeah.
recommendation, which is an
Well,
official part of the
and
like
nutrition I've done, and I think for SIPO,
sorry.
now she's taken up,
And
and I finish one day put in the dryer. We go talk with my daughter. She just
Marco, I think you're muted now. Mark, there we go.
mute. Okay, sorry, I've been muted. Sorry. So I was saying like it comes out like with the proceedings of this procedure, which are public and known. It's like there is a final report and says, okay, with this recommendation that would be taken into account for the final approval. These are like they come into the process with an advanced draft, and then it's like there is a final approval of all the documents and technical documents, and then it's like the project gets approved through this process. And it can like sort of like if there is a dissent which is very strong, it can like cause a sort of like appeal that goes like escalated to a more political level, to relevant ministries and national government and stuff. And so it's like the thing is like if there is a big disagreement, there have been cases also on transit projects, like especially regarding like heritage and this kind of stuff. But it's relatively rare because it's something that really escalates to the political level. It gets on the press. It gets very politicized at this point. Uh, so why it's a second carrot process? Because like the project owner steers the process and preside over the conference, so it's the one that like can like handle all the procedure. There's a time certainty and some provision against no show or delaying practices like, oh yes, one just doesn't respond to the emails, even if the official email they're required to respond to, they don't. But if they don't show up, like absence is equal to approval, implicit approval of the process of the project. The request changes from each party must be discussed with all parties and must be motivated. They cannot just say no. They have to say no and send a written like motivation why they don't agree with the solution that has been discussed with the parties. It's a majority-based consensus, so single party does not have a power to veto a decision. Everything is public. The minutes of the meeting are public and recirculated first between the meeting, and then when everything is approved, is part of the annexes that are published on the website, saying, okay, this is the, like this is the report, this is like the minutes, these are the emails that have been exchanged, and all it's like public facing. So if the press wants to see who are the bad behaviors, they can look into this. So requests for change must be adequately motivated, as I see, and discussed with the parties. And there are also carrots to smooth over conflicts. For example, there is a process which is called an exploratory CDS, like an exploratory conference of parties, that can be done in the early phases of project design to scope a bit when there are like some stuff that you can see that are like sensitive issues with. They're not committal, but if they're already committed during this process, it's hard for them to say at the end, no, we didn't really mean it, we change idea. They can be like additional time in meetings even beyond the timeline established by the law, because nobody's gonna sanction anybody if this, like instead of lasting 90 days, it lasts 180 days. And they can even direct, like the RUP can direct the consultants to collaborate with a third party toward a solution in a separate sort of spin-off of this process. Where does this come into? So the process of the planning and approval of a transit project is quite long, but essentially you have a preliminary project that is the one to submit, which is sort of 30% design, which is submitted for grants and like funding and so on. This comes what is called the final design stage, which is a 60% phase, and it's during this process at the same time at the evaluation, environmental evaluation, and eventually at some sort of public debate or some sort of participatory process that might vary between regions. And this is like an example just to show of a timeline of a recent project that you can see. So, like you have the gray one at the top is like the funding, and it's what it would be like a new start grants or whatever. It's like the different levels of like funding from federal government or national government in this case. Then it's the development of the feasibility project, environmental screening, and some sort of like when the approval of the final design. So it's a process that can last 6-7 months, and it's like in parallel with the development and approval of the final design of the project before the procurement. So it's really when you go into procurement, normally you go into procurement of very final design, like what's called executive design, with a list of recommendations coming with a project revised and a list of recommendations, because some of the recommendations are something that really has impact on the very detailed final engineering. So it's a list of recommendations for the ones that are going to do the final engineering. So I think I've done an overview of this, and I'm open for a question now. I hope I'm within my time. I hope, yeah, just 2 minutes more. Sorry.
Oh, you did great. Marco, what are the impacts of the permit changes? What are the impacts that have come as a result of these permit changes? Have you seen, I mean, projects are being delivered, but what sort of evidence demonstrates the like transformation in the permitting process?
So the permitting process has much more certainty. So there's much less that this can come like later during the procurement, things that comes after the procurement and especially during the construction itself. It can vary between regions, and especially it has been like improved a lot in a reform of like 10 years ago that sort of like smoothed some processes. There are still some issues, but it's mostly linked to how projects are funded. So that's a different thing that creates a lot of uncertainty about also decision. But in terms of like this sort of like project blocked because they didn't really comply with something, blocked by environmental review or stuff, this is like really shrinked over time. At the same time, it really depends on the capacity of the authority, like the project owner, and this really varies really depending on level, size of cities, part of the country. So there is a component of state capacity which is really hard to enforce by law, which a law is just like about the administrative process. So the results are like in general, it's considered as a success of their firm in general, but there are like some still issues. But it's mostly about, like as I said, financing and state capacity of being able to steer this process that requires like like a lot of parties to be like collaborative and like well intentioned.
That's great. I know we'll have more questions for you after Colin and Kirk share their experience as well. I'm very curious how you'd recommend applying this work in a US context. But I now want to introduce Kirk.
Abigail,
Oh
I'm
yeah.
curious about that. Let Marco shoot on that one.
Yeah, go ahead, Marco.
So I'm not an expert of the let's say of the permitting, like especially knowing that there are like so many different regional differences throughout the US, because it's heavily regulated at the state level, as that's my understanding. So like there are some issues. I know that this is a form of like self-permitting, as I said. It's a mediated one. It's a self-permitting that is not like just like without constraints. But is this something like the United States can really accept that agencies, because especially in Italy, these kind of projects are like owned by cities, municipalities, sometimes by regional governments, but they are really owned by agencies. There is not such a thing as a transit agency in Italy. There are like planning authorities and stuff like that are like above the municipal level, but it's so like it's a heavily political process in a way. So is it something that like losing some powers to some sort of like to the agencies is something like local jurisdictions would like to accept? So that's a big question. So I know. I mean, I think the inspiration could be that really the shuttle, like what we've seen, like in some state cases that we have studied, like New York or Boston, that especially New York, the permitting was very cumbersome, and this kind of thing can really simplify or at least put on the same table a lot of actors. Then extractive behaviors or very politically confrontative, like in places where like for example we have like dozens of municipalities that are crossed by a project in a very fragmented local governance, that I don't really know if it's something that this alone as a model can solve. I don't think so. That can be like a blueprint to sort of like smooth out something that is like a mix of stick and carrots, let's say. I think that's the interesting part of this tool.
Yeah, it sounds like the three sort of keys are um, transparency and having clear deadlines in the process and then like leveraging the sticks and the carrots in a way that thread that needle sound very important. Kirk or Colin, do you have any more questions before we pass the baton? Kirk is the executive director of Transportation Choices Coalition. Prior to his work at TCC, Kirk was the executive director of Commute Seattle and served as the executive director of Move Redmond. And while he was there, he led the organization's work to make it easier to walk, bike, and bus for hundreds of thousands of people who work around Washington State and Washington and Redmond, Washington. Washington recently passed a transit permitting bill in this legislative cycle, which I believe you'll update us on, Kirk. And it removed some hurdles to transit agency permitting. So take it away, Kirk.
Absolutely. Thanks, Abigail. And one, as an NYU grad, I'm so thrilled that my alma mater is supporting Marco and the Transit Cost Projects that's doing great research on these topics. And one, I mean, I stand on the shoulders of the people who came before me. Abigail was the former advocacy director at Transportation Choices Coalition. We would not have the light rail expansions that permitting can speed up without her advocacy in making this happen. So huge props to Abigail. I'm Kirk Hovenkotter. I'm the executive director of Transportation Choices Coalition. If you're not familiar with our organization, we are Washington State's nonprofit transit advocate. For 33 years, we've been a coalition of business, labor, transit agencies, transit riders, and elected leaders, all beating the drum for investments in transit and safe walks to transit. We do a lot of work in our state legislature. We organize transit riders across the state, but we're most known for running and winning ballot measure campaigns. We ran the campaigns in 96, 2008, and 2016 to expand light rail across the Puget Sound region, as well as we successfully passed the Seattle Transportation Levy in 2024, the largest levy in city history to fund streets, trails, and transit. I really got my start in this work and transit advocacy on that 2008 campaign to expand light rail across the region. I was wearing a cardboard light rail vehicle costume, talking to students on UW, University of Washington campus, trying to get them to register to vote and vote for light rail. And it's just so exciting to see so many of these projects opening just over the last few years. And we'll have the culmination of Sound Transit 2 coming up this Friday with the opening of the Cross Lake Connection light rail going across Lake Washington and crossing on a floating bridge for the first time in the world, which is really exciting. And at that opening, you're going to see so much excitement from people across this region for light rail and for these projects. We'll have tens of thousands of people at these openings, riding the trains, just really celebrating this moment and what it means for the region. It's the culmination of that Sound Transit 2 ballot measure. This is the final line of it. It really shows that our region can envision big things and deliver big things, but it takes a while. I think if you ask any of those people who come to those openings, that the only thing they would want more than getting light rail is getting it done sooner. Light rail expansion is incredibly popular, but people want it done. And that's really at the core of this permitting bill that went forward earlier this legislative session, which is called SB 6309. To preface this a little bit, and before I dive into the details of the bill, after I advocated for that campaign in 2008, I ended up working at the city of Redmond, where one of these extensions in that Sound Transit 2 measure that passed in 2008 went to. And I got to be in the planning department at a time when the city of Redmond was permitting for light rail and trying to get it built in their city. And this was a city with leadership, a mayor who really saw the value of light rail, really cared about it, created light rail as a permitted use in their city, bought right of way that light rail could be run on within their city, and just really championed the investment to make this happen. The mayor of the city of Redmond joined as the board chair of the Sound Transit Board and really believed in delivering light rail. And that was an eye-opening experience for me to really see the value of political leadership to be able to speed up transit projects. It was thanks to that work that the city of Redmond did that when Sound Transit 3, our next huge light rail expansion that passed in 2016, just 9 years after that election in 2016, we opened up a line to downtown Redmond, which for construction in terms of planning, permitting, building in this region, 9 years from the ballot measure to running service and having the public be able to ride it is huge, is really fast. But we know it's not fast enough, which is really where this permitting bill, SB 6309, comes in. Transportation Choices Coalition kicked off this legislative session with our legislative agenda. And one of the items that we had on it as a part was to speed up light rail construction and make sure that we were building light rail faster. This is all a part of a campaign that we're running called the Build the Damn Trains campaign, which this work is funded by Arnold Ventures. I don't know if Jared Stolfus is on today, but he's a great partner on it. But really, so much of this work is making sure that we don't cancel light rail projects, keep projects moving, and really respond to this public desire to get projects built. And so a part of our legislative agenda for that campaign was to win more financial flexibility for the agency, but also to speed up permitting. And that really led to this bill, SB 6309, which I really call permitting acupuncture. You saw Marco's presentation, which is all about how we create brand new structures. This permitting acupuncture bill, SB 6309, really learns from the challenges of trying to build Sound Transit 2 that we're completing this next week, and how do we apply those lessons to Sound Transit 3. SB 6309, as passed, does one major change that is going to help cut years off of building and permitting light rail projects. I'll talk a little bit more about what else we wanted it to do, but of course, in the legislative process, you don't get everything you want in one session. So the big win of SB 6309 is that it allows processes for condemnation and land use permitting, which were sequential, to be parallel. It's not that complicated, but it saves years in terms of getting these projects done. So what SB 6309 allows regional transportation authorities to do is to start the condemnation process for acquiring land and issue land use permits at the same time. Sound Transit has the legal authority, which is one of our regional transportation authorities, has the legal authority to condemn land. But that's a process that working with landowners can take about 18 months to 2 years. You also have the land use permitting process, which can also take, 18 months to about 2 years. What the rules had been in the past was that Sound Transit had to own all of its land before it could issue permits for them. Even though it had the condemnation authority, it had the legal right to be able to get this land. What this bill allows, it's really just urban acupuncture, learning from the lessons of Sound Transit 2 is allowing them to do those two things in parallel, which staff at Sound Transit estimate will help or would have helped them save about 1.5 to 2 years on delivering one of the lines in Sound Transit 2, the East Link line that runs from Seattle to Redmond. This is, once again, it seems wonky, but it is these little nips and tucks around the permitting process, giving Sound Transit authority that is going to help speed up Sound Transit 3 in delivering these projects as we move into permitting them through jurisdictions across the region. Uh, but SB 6309, which we are thrilled to be at the bill signing of this coming Monday at 3 p.m. If you're people who want to watch TV Washington, you can watch it get signed by our governor at 3 p.m. It's going to be a scene. Uh, it's not everything we wanted. Of course, another element that was going to be looked at in the bill, in the initial drafts of it that we were pushing, was uh, being able to vest the land use codes of cities at the time when the Sound Transit Board approved alignments. This is really to get at challenges we'd seen with certain jurisdictions like Mercer Island, who, after voters had approved the alignments and the board had selected their preferred alignment, changed their land use codes to require other things of regional transportation authorities that were building light rail. This leads to some, of the most egregious examples of asking for things like fire trucks, but really it led to changing the goalposts for Sound Transit, making it really difficult to be able to understand what the city wanted to get those permits. The idea of vesting those land use codes would make it so there's a level playing field once the board of the transit agency chooses their alignment and cities can't pull the rug out from under them. It wasn't passed in this legislative session, but something that we're going to continue to fight and win in future legislative sessions to make sure that we can build Sound Transit 3 as quickly as possible and deliver for riders. But I'm just really inspired by so much of the work that I'm seeing across the country by other people who are fighting to deliver transit faster. So, one, I really encourage everyone to check out our website. Please check out the Build the Damn Trains campaign page that I shared in the chat. And also, if you want to see more about what we won in the legislative session, please check out our blog post that not only documents the permitting bill, but also documents some of the other initiatives that we fought for, like our Mega Project for Safety initiative to fix and build and rebuild our Main Street highways, our stroads in Washington State. Really excited for this conversation and to hear some of the ideas that people have here. Happy to speak more to SB 6309. But my final plug is we are a nonprofit with 8 staff working on behalf of the state of 8 million. We need support to be able to do this. And if you want to continue to see legislation get passed that helps build light rail faster, please consider donating to Transportation Choices Coalition to support this work. So I want to thank Abigail for having me. I want to thank you all for being here and just really honored to be a part of this illustrious panel. So I'll stop there.
Kirk, before we bring Colin in, there's a question in the chat. Was there much local agency opposition to the new permitting legislation?
I mean, there's the Association of Washington Cities. They are the lobby for our cities. And of course, their antennae are always up when it looks like something is trying to take out authority. And I think the vesting for land use codes was something that raised their antennae. And as you can see, it's not a part of the final bill. And that's going to be a challenge going forward. So I think there's a lot of those where you're trying to, take authority away from a jurisdiction or perceive taking authority away from jurisdiction. There's battles there, especially when you look at an agency like Sound Transit, where the board is made up of elected officials from those jurisdictions. So they have kind of conflicting interests there. I think what was really powerful for us is there's a bunch of things we can clean up with this acupuncture, like allowing condemnation and permitting to happen in parallel rather than sequentially, that clean up a lot of those really quickly. We've proven we can get that done, and we're going to continue to clean up these things while we have conversations with our jurisdictional partners about why these changes will be a benefit to their voters and their constituents. But it's a great question.
Yeah. Great. Colin Parent is the CEO and General Counsel for Circulate Planning and Research, Policy and Research. Is that your new name, Colin? Congratulations on the new name.
It's Circulate Planning and Policy.
Planning and Policy. Okay.
Yes, you can be excused for not remembering because we just changed it on Tuesday.
He's a former elected member of the City Council of La Mesa, California, and Circulate Planning and Policy published an incredible report powerless, with the best name, the powerless broker, that you're going to talk through today. So take it away, Colin.
Great. Thanks so much, Abigail. And thanks everyone for joining. Um, I put a link in the chat to our report that I'm going to be discussing, if people want to read it. And it's so great to see so many people from the San Diego region here on this call, including a lot of people who know a great deal more about this than I do. So feel free to ask questions and correct the record if I get something wrong. Um, Let's go through. Yeah, so just a background. So I run. We just changed our name, but haven't updated all of our slides. So I'm CEO and General Counsel of Circulate, former City Council member in La Mesa, and before working at Circulate, mostly had a background in housing policy as opposed to transportation policy, but spent some time in the private sector, representing large corporations. And that's my contact information if anyone would like to follow up after this. So a little bit about Circulate. Our organization is 27 years old. We are the byproduct of a merger of Walk San Diego, which was about pedestrian concerns, and Move San Diego, which was primarily a transit advocacy organization, to be an organization that we were, until for about a decade, we're called Circulate San Diego, and we have three core issue focuses: public transit, safe streets, and sustainable growth. Our organization, we do a lot of research and advocacy. We publish research reports like the Powerless Brokers, but we also have an in-house planning team. And so most of our team actually does fee-for-service planning for local agencies. So the Powerless Broker is, if you didn't get the joke, it is a reference to the Power Broker, a very important and well regarded profile and biography of Robert Caro, the master builder of New York, who was critiqued in that great book for being sort of a tyrant and someone who had too much authority and could kind of bulldoze through New York to accomplish whatever he chose, and it was a real cautionary tale about too much power in the hands of public sector actors. Fast forward today, we have a situation where transit agencies are tasked with building public transit, but have almost no power to be able to do the things that we are asking them to do. And so we thought that the Powerless Brokers was a good way to kind of sum up that mirror image of what between Robert Caro and modern transit agencies. Certainly the things that we have in here are examples in California, but many of the dynamics that we identify are challenges that people face, transit agencies face throughout the country. So the report focuses on a variety of specific case studies with a huge amount of details and footnotes about some of the third-party permitting challenges facing transit agencies as they're trying to build their projects. And just to clarify, this is not about getting projects approved. This is not about getting projects funded. This is all about once projects are approved, once they're funded, once their boards have signed off on them and they're ready to go. The reality is that they don't get to just go. What they have to do after that whole public process is done, after all environmental review is done, after all funding is secured, projects are then tasked with going through this whole extra process that's completely non-public, maybe not completely, but oftentimes very non-public, that is requiring them to receive third-party permits from local jurisdictions, from utility districts, from all sorts of other agencies for the permission to build these projects that have been approved. And so one of the examples that we profiled was the California High-Speed Rail project, which is probably the most famous of projects that have and the largest projects that's been facing these kinds of issues. The Office of Inspector General from the High-Speed Rail Agency considers these third-party permits the top risk facing the authority. And so it's been very difficult for them to receive entitlement and rights of way in order to build this project that has been approved by the voters, is approved by the legislature, and for which there's an ongoing source of funding to build. And then there's some specific examples that we identified in this from both the city of Wasco and the city of Shafter, and where they were just some quotes, some very explicit quotes about city leadership holding these projects hostage so that they could extract certain local benefits out of those projects. And so we have a couple of quotes right here. This is not me saying they're trying to extract data or dollars from this project. This is them admitting to the newspaper that what they're doing is they're trying to hold up this public project so they can extract things that are unrelated to the project that they feel would benefit their jurisdiction. So I just what this shows is there's this dynamic that we have in place where you have the permitting authorities oftentimes are agnostic to a project. They may even be antagonistic to a project and are not currently, there's oftentimes no mechanism to encourage them or to require them to faithfully implement these projects that transit agencies are trying to build. So in the Los Angeles, we had a profile of the Purple Line, which is a large project that recently just opened in Los Angeles. And this is a big light rail extension. And this is politically a different dynamic from high-speed rail. For this example, the city of Los Angeles is in strong support of LA Metro's efforts to build the Purple Line extension. But nevertheless, it still faced a number of the same problems. And so I think the big ticket number here is that their contingency budget was exhausted with 3 years of the project left still to go. And so LA Metro had to add another $200 million to the project scope. And the reason that contingency was exhausted was just from a whole variety of issues where the local permitting agency, which is there was more than one, but I mean the city of Los Angeles being a prime example, just added all sorts of extra bells and whistles and requirements beyond the scope of things that LA Metro had included. So even though the mayor of Los Angeles has a plurality of the votes on LA Metro and functionally controls that board, the apparatus of the government of the city of Los Angeles wasn't on board in the same way and required all sorts of changes and scope changes that drove the price and delayed the implementation of that project. And then we have two other examples. One is a project in the coastal zone in the Northern California area, which is not included in the slide here, but it's definitely an interesting one if you care to look at it. And then the other project that we profiled was the Sandag in the San Diego area, their Mid-Coast Trolley extension. And we profiled this one really as a counterexample, an example of a project that actually seemed to go pretty well, and wanted to identify some of the reasons for that. So one is that it was a joint project between Sandag, MTS, Sandag is the Regional Transportation Agency. It's also the MPO, has actually a variety of designations and powers, partnering with MTS, the local transit operator, and the city of San Diego. And so they established a variety of agreements between one another early in the process, and that allowed for them to make decisions in a more comprehensive and streamlined way, and to get some unity of vision before they started trying to break ground. And so that was good. It's good staff work, good relationships. It helps that San Diego has a relatively fewer set of agencies than, say, Los Angeles. And so people can know each other, and there's a culture of that collaboration in our region. But part of the reason that it worked is also that Sandag and MTS, they have special statutory authorities that not every other transit agency has. And so at the end of the day, if Sandag and MTS don't get what they need out of City of San Diego, they can take it. And so they have rights to the local, they have the ability to exercise, to build things across the local right-of-ways of other jurisdictions in their region. Politically, that's hard, but legally, they can do it. Same thing with they can self-permit certain projects and buildings and even include their own building code process if they want, and they exercise some of those powers in the course of building that project. And so just some of the the challenges that are facing transit agencies in this space is that there's just different incentives, right? So you have the third parties, like those examples in the for the California High Speed Rail. They just have different incentive. They have maybe little incentive to comply. They have the power to delay those projects if they want, because they're in no hurry to get these projects done. And then they can ask for out of scope exactions in exchange for compliance. Standards are oftentimes very unclear. One of the challenges that we identified in Los Angeles is that there are a whole bunch of this particular transit line that they are looking at and doing in LA Metro has to run across 7 different agencies, and all of them have different engineering standards, and there's no common application or process for approvals, and so. Even though the standards are like technically very similar, they're in different documents, they're in different decision makers who get to review them. And then there's just a coordination problem that oftentimes these things that should be incorporated into the before approval get asked for by third-party agencies after approval. It's an ad hoc process, and in a lot of cases, especially when projects are running through smaller jurisdictions, there's no experience in those smaller jurisdictions with dealing with a complicated transit project. And so that may not be anyone's fault, but it nevertheless creates challenges and complications. But that doesn't mean that we can't do anything about this, right? And so in our report, we provided a variety of recommendations, really through a sort of a tiering approach. Some that were easier to accomplish, that maybe wouldn't accomplish, but maybe have a minor benefit, as well as some politically challenging reforms that would probably do a lot of good if we could get them across the finish line. And the big idea here is that in all of those, the concept is what we need to do is we need to allocate some more authority to transit agencies themselves to be able to get these projects done. You could do that in a very substantial way, like give them all the authority to self-permit and just do what they need to do. That's probably politically pretty challenging. But you could do some other things that are maybe not as big, not as challenging, but not as impactful, but still make some difference. And so we give you a couple examples here on this slide. So right now, federal broadband rules already allow telecom companies to get a shot clock for when they submit permits. And if these permits are not approved within a certain amount of time by a third-party permitting agency, the permits are issued automatically. That's a power the federal government has granted to private companies, and we have not granted them to public transit agencies. That seems like something we could do. In the housing space, in California, we have a bill called SB 330, which requires that local jurisdictions adopt objective design standards, at least for housing. So that housing developers are able to know what it takes to get a project approved. That is not always the case for transit agencies. So local governments may have no written standards, may not have any, and certainly no public standards about what it might take to approve a project. A simple thing that could be done is to require them to adopt and publish objective design standards. And then again, to that example from Sandag, Sandag has the right of way for projects and utilities within their ambit. That could be a power that could be extended, if not to every transit agency, maybe just to the big sophisticated ones, right? So maybe you don't want to give that power to a small bus operator who doesn't have that kind of sophistication and experience that Sandag or LA Metro does. But nevertheless, you could provide those kinds of authorities to larger transit builders who are repeat players and who could responsibly exercise those kinds of authorities. And so yeah, so this is the kind of the hierarchy of the different types of improvements or reforms that could be. You got the most impactful but most politically difficult at the top, which would be to grant transit authorities full responsibility to self-permit. Probably that would be a large abrogation of local control, but would allow transit agencies to get things done. And then sort of you tier down to kind of the least impactful, but probably most politically viable, especially in the near term, which is to, sure, third parties can retain their permitting rules, but they have to have a transparency of standards so that transit agencies have some clear idea of what they need to do in order to receive the permitting. And then there's a bunch of gradations in between. And so for those of you who are thinking about, this seems really hard, where I don't know that we can do everything that Marco's talking about in their example, right? Maybe, the California legislature won't let us be Italy. Well, that's okay. Well, we can still make an incremental step, and that would still do some good. And that is the end. I appreciate everyone being here.
Thanks so much. California, nowhere in the US is Italy quite yet. I have a question for, I guess, both Colin and Kirk, and feel free to raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question or add your question in the chat and I can ask it. Permitting reform isn't just a transit challenge. Housing, we've had permitting issues with housing. We've had transmission permitting challenges. Are there opportunities to work with some of these other big major project permitting challenges in leveraging these changes? What are some of the opportunities and trade-offs coordinating on these major projects to improve overall state capacity for permitting processes?
Yeah, well, you gotta be a transit advocate attending the Housing California conference and learning and talking to other people. Yeah, no, I think it's there's different bodies of law and there's different sort of communities of practice in this space, right? And so there's just oftentimes not a lot of overlap. Circulates, we pride ourselves as trying to cover, the both of those spaces to as best as we can. But I do think, yeah, I think we have to be open to looking to other places. Like one of the things that we were happy about in our permitting, in our report, we pointed out not just the housing transit, but that the telecom companies get they have the permitting challenges too, and they've been able to innovate and succeed in getting certain kinds of permitting reform for their concerns. And so we should take that as a successful example that we might want to replicate for our spaces, and vice versa. That with like I mentioned with SB 330, there have been some relatively more successful efforts for housing permitting, at least in California, vis-a-vis transit. And so we should be looking at those and seeing if we can replicate those models.
Yeah. Abigail, answer your question is yes. Like, there's a reason why this stuff is hard. And you need a broad coalition to be able to make these changes in the legislature. You can't just be, a transit advocate beating down the door for this. You need to find friends and partners. I think we have a ton to learn from the housing advocacy community that was able to win a lot of permitting reform in Washington State over the last few years. But I do think for us to be able to build linear transportation projects, we have a lot of great partners in people who are trying to get utilities built, trying to get sewer lines built, things that really benefit people. And so I think there are broader coalitions we can build. And I think there's folks who already see that you have to partner to be able to get projects done. Here in the city of Seattle, our utility, our Seattle Public Utility, which doesn't have the ability to permit on SDOT right-of-way the way that our Department of Transportation does, partners most of their replacement of our 100-year sewers with our transit projects because they know that the hardest part of it is getting the permits to rip up the streets. And so that's why so many of our transit expansions here in the city of Seattle are really just sewer projects with transit frosting and that are funded by the Federal Transit Administration because there isn't a federal sewer administration to be able to fund these projects.
In Italy, Marco, we have a question. In Italy, who runs this one-stop shop conference? What's the agency that operates and oversees oversees
It's
that?
the agency that run the project. So it's for each project, it depends. Like normally for transit projects, it's gonna be either the municipality for local transit projects or some sort of agency delegated by the municipality, or for like railway, national railway projects is the National Railway Network Manager Company, like RFI. So it really depends, but it's all authorities that are either public or delegated by the public. If it's a private project, so they're not transit infrastructure projects, they're like private, but they're like private public partnerships. It's run by the main permitting agency. So the main agency that it's like required to give a permit for a given project. So they run the show on behalf of the private demand, like the private owner, because the private owner cannot really self permit, like legally they cannot. So it's really the agency. It really helps when you have something like it's a municipality, it's a project that stays mostly within the border of the municipality. It helps in Italy that municipalities often own shares of utility companies, so they sort of they are the same people on the table. Not always, but like for like water, sewage, and so on, it's always on the responsibility of like cities. So it's but it's essentially it's a form. That's why it's a form of self-permitting, because they run the show. They need to follow. I mean, there is a sort of like they have to get the permission from the regional government. There is a sort of formal procedure to start this. They cannot just they have to follow the law quite closely. But it's they run the show. Yeah, essentially.
Franklin, go ahead.
Hi, I have a question for all the presenters today, and there has I read an SKCD comics about how there's like 15 different standards for a certain thing, and this comic protagonist wants to create a standard to unify all the remaining 15 standards, and now we have 16 standards. And my question pertains to that comic is, if we want to grant some public agency certain powers to streamline just public project delivery in general, are there existing frameworks within the United States as an example to start or build the foundations of that avoids creating another public agency to do the same exact job and further fragment the delivery pipeline? Because in New York City, there's the New York City DDC, the Development Corporation, the Economic Development Corporation, and Empire Development, and Trust for Public Land, and the Parks Department, and the Department of City Planning, all are within the larger realm of permitting, building projects, and public works. But the timeline, as you may see in New York City and many other American cities, are very long. And it's very easy to assume that, oh, we create a bigger agency as big as, say, the MTA that might solve all these problems. But we have a lot of real life existing examples to the contrary. So my question for everybody is this idea or like the need to create another big agency to solve this problem needed? Or should we actually look at the reforms to see if we can pick out some certain components of existing agencies and try to merge these resources together to form that agency? Thank you.
This is a great final question.
Yeah, I guess I mean, just some examples about sort of a common sets of rules. So at least in California, so every jurisdiction, every state in state in the United States has to have a highway design manual according to federal law. And in California, at least, the highway design manual provides a variety of rules and design standards for when local governments interact with or cross the Caltrans right of way. And what the effect of that is that there is a statewide standard that local governments all live by and apply in their projects, and they use that and are obligated to use that for a variety of their projects. I think we could absolutely imagine something similar statewide or nationwide, right? But I mean, or even just within an MPO or a transit agency's jurisdiction, where they say, listen, we're going to adopt from on high a standard, and everyone has to abide by that standard. There's that you can absolutely do that. Now, politically, yeah, it's hard to do that. People don't want to give up their local control and autonomy, but there's no like no reason you couldn't. And there's plenty of examples of those kinds of standards being adopted from a higher level of government being imposed upon lower levels of government.
Okay. Well, Kirk or Marco, any final thoughts to share as we wrap up our webinar today? Any sort of like takeaways you want to leave our participants with?
Yeah, first.
I mean, I think we're always looking for one silver bullet solution, and I think it's gonna be smaller things that we're chipping away at here, and it's more like pruning a bonsai tree to be able to get to really good permitting. And I think it's the act of building that you realize what the problems are. So I think there's so much of like we just need to keep projects moving forward, but we also need to keep this mindset of like how we're gonna continue to solve these fixed problems in the state legislature. And we're really hoping that the passage of 6309 is just the start of this. We're excited to do a much bigger push in the next legislative session. So if people have inspirational policies that they think we should implement in Washington State, please send them my way. I'll plug in my email into the chat.
Great.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like I don't have much to add. It's really, I think there are like some themes that are like coming again, like transparency is one. So both the Italian Conference of Parties and what Colin said, it's like that could be like the first step of like having more accountability in these processes that can be like very extracting processes. And I think it's like, or even as Kirk said, like already like what looks like a small reform that like you are able to do something in parallel instead of in a sequence. This is already something like sort of like make things faster. So there are like it's a very complex thing, and already like us being here discussing about this very specific and niche topic, I think it's already a starting point because it's a huge endeavor, like change this kind of stuff.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, everyone here. This is intended just to be a starting place for this conversation. I think everyone has a lot to learn on this in the United States, and these small tweaks are really important. And learning what they are, learning where we're all sort of experiencing these challenges across the country. We have folks from New York, California, Washington, Boston here today, and I'm excited to continue to engage and learn from all of you on what tweaks we're making, what are the silver bullet elements, what are the buckshot elements to speed up and deliver transit. Thank you all so much and have a great weekend.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
You.